we recognize. And we've been trying to find opportunities that get us out of our disciplinary silos to change that metaphor to something that looks more like these gears that you see on the screen here, so that they can work together more like an engine, so that can crank up innovation in these complex problems spaces. So the idea is that we kind of put solutions out there in the world that come from this multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary approach. And then, of course, drilling down to the individual from the social. If I could have the next slide. We've also begun to see that it may matter kind of closer to home, that when you're out there, if you're a graduate student on the call today, or a postdoc, this will stand you better if you get involved in these kinds of conversations in the marketplace. It'll stand you better when you're out there looking for a job, that you can build up your own capacity to have these kinds of cross-disciplinary conversations. So this semester, if I could go to the next slide, in addition to having these conversations, we are actually offering 2 labs that kind of bring it into the practical realm to get you this kind of experience that we're talking about. One is underway that has to do with inequalities in education, and another is starting in session B, health, communities, and inequality. And our 2 speakers today are from that lab experience. So if you're interested, you can still sign up for our session B lab. And then we're going to keep these conversations going with the monthly web series, and we're interested in topics that are interesting to you. So at the end of today's session, we'll have a survey, and we'd love to hear from you about what you'd like to hear. So let me turn it over to introduce our 2 speakers. We have Professor Felipe Castro, who is a professor and Southwest Borderlands Scholar from Edson College of Nursing and Health Innovation, and Dawn Gilpin, an Assistant Dean for Research and Associate Honors Professor in the Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our speakers. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Tamara. Felipe, do you want to kick us off and talk a little bit about the research that you've done in this area?
Oh, sure, absolutely. And we're so glad to have you. There's a lot of interesting things here, and we'd like to take you on a brief tour of some of those. First of all, we're talking about complex problems, and complex problems occur in complex systems. In other words, it's not relegated to one little location. There's a lot going on. How do we put our arms around this so we can understand and organize in order to try to solve them? One of the basic approaches is the use of ecological models. And there's several variations. You may have seen these. These are like concentric circles. And so it shows what has been called in the past an approach which is called the biopsychosocial approach. It puts together biological factors which are very small in nature, cells and human organs and humans themselves, but they exist within a broader periphery. So the micro level is encapsulated within what we call the meso level, and that's really a broader community approach, and those communities can be small or large. But then you have the macro level, the largest, and that is even broader, and so these are encapsulated within each other. One approach many years ago, a model by Engel, said that the person is the smallest unit of the micro systems, is the largest unit of the microsystems, excuse me, but the smallest of the macro systems. And so he kind of put us as at the center of this universe of different systems. Now in public health, we do have a variety of these concentric ecological models that begin to put a picture together of what are some of the factors that influence health and other important outcomes. And that's what we look at. There's an article that we had at our last session, we're going to have it again, on ecological models revisited, that says the strengths and weaknesses of those. I won't get into a lot of detail there, other to say that it's very important to think in terms of systems if we're going to address systems that created and can be modified to change these complex problems. And part of it is that you are going to be in the driver's seat once taking these evidence-based tools to put them to work so that you can move forward and propose something that can be a solution to this complex problem, taking into account that you would need to think in terms of the systems themselves. What are the local systems that are interacting? What are the forces that need to be modified? So with that as a prelude, these are the kinds of things that we will put on the table, but we want you to, as said in motivational interviewing, take what you need and leave the rest. You are the consumer, you are the designer. And Dr. Gilpin and I are here to guide you, but ultimately we want you to be in the driver's seat, so to speak. Yeah. Sorry for mixing metaphors, but I hope you get the idea. We want you to be in charge, and we are here to help. So let me turn it over to Dr. Gilpin, as she will tell you more about a specialty activity that relates to understanding who can be your partners in this effort to solve a complex problem.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Castro. I have to say, this whole experience, which we also taught a similar class last spring, has just been such a fantastic experience for me, personally and professionally, getting to work with fantastic people like Dr. Castro. And I was also learned a lot. And one of the things that is central really to this whole initiative is the fact that we do all bring our own perspective to solving any kind of problem. We bring the methods that we've learned, the theories that we are familiar with, the kinds of problems that we are used to addressing them, and how we typically approach them. And we are forced to reconsider that and work together with people who come at things from a very different angle. And the goal is to come out of this with something that is much better and new and completely specific to the group. So this class, as Dr. Castro was suggesting, is very much determined by the students who are in it. So, last year we had students from theater education, and engineering, and religious studies, and social justice, and journalism, and nursing, and that created a very particular mixture. Whoever is in this class is going to create a different kind of mixture and bring these things to it. And I say all of that kind of as a prelude because when talking about these ecological and stakeholder maps, I come to the table with my own perspective and experience, which is a little bit different from Felipe's. So my background is in strategic communication, and my research is about complex systems, so complex social systems specifically. So I kind of combine those two things. And whenever I have found myself professionally or when teaching about strategic communication, one of the very first things that we all have to do is to figure out what is the lay of the land. So if I have identified a social problem, say I want to understand the impact of rising housing prices on certain particular communities in the Phoenix metro area, right? Just to pull out an example, I have to first thing I have to do is figure out who is involved in this. And by that, I mean, not just the individuals. So what community I've identified, and that means where are they? Where are they scattered all over the Phoenix metro area? Do I want to focus on a particular one? Do I want to drill down even more specifically and talk about particular demographics, maybe the elderly, or people with disabilities, or people of a particular ethnic background? So, all of those are questions that I have to answer. And as I make those decisions, that's going to determine who is involved. The individuals, the community, the physical location of where these people are, but also what entities are involved in this. So are there housing authorities? Are there HOAs? Are there kinds of grant programs that are available? Are there developers? All of the players, and what are the relationships? This is where I also come at this from a network analysis perspective. So I'm always really interested not just in who is involved, but what are the relationships between them? And how do that affect this overall ecology, right? And it might sound quite straightforward. Well, sure, if I have an issue that I want to tackle or a problem, I just find out who's involved and then I get involved. Well, it's usually not quite that simple, also because it tends to be unfolding as you start talking to people or finding out more about them. You ask them questions, they can tell you about other players that they have either run up against or cooperated with in trying to solve this problem. So that map will be shifting, and that will shape your plan for how you can approach a problem. Because until you know the overall factors and the players and those relationships, you can't even really identify your entry point. Where do you fit? Or your project, where would that fit within this landscape or this ecology? And who would you need to at least try to develop relationships with? And what form would those relationships take? You really can only figure that out once you have a good overview. I think a lot of people, well-meaning folks who want to solve important social problems, go charging in, or they identify one or two high-profile individuals or organizations and just go straight there, and they often miss out on opportunities, places, problems that are maybe not being addressed that are related over here, because these folks are covering one issue, but so who's getting left out? So one of the things that you always have to be thinking about when you are putting together an ecological or stakeholder map is also who is missing and who or what is being left out of this picture. Because that also can help you, figure out your path forward. And one of the driving principles that we follow in this course is to try to make sure that the students are able to follow a community-driven problem-solving process. That really takes the actual needs of a particular community or population into account and doesn't just come up with ideas or from around a table, right, from outside. That it really is about trying to get in there and get your hands dirty, have this community-driven approach, but it's also about constantly centering the most vulnerable. Who within this particular domain is most vulnerable? And then as you narrow down, and who of those people might be the most vulnerable? Again, who is being left out? And that's where you can identify some opportunities that, if it's a project that you want to carry forward, might be a potential interest to, say, funding agencies or, small people who want to contribute to the social fabric. And, maybe it doesn't even take that many resources to get something off the ground, but you need to be identifying a need that isn't being addressed adequately by existing entities and actions.
Sure, absolutely. And now we'd like to go to questions. I'll just make a couple of comments. As you can see from what Dr. Gilpin was presenting, this requires teamwork, but it's not just any old teamwork, it's transdisciplinary, meaning complex problems will only be solved by a series of individuals that contribute their talents in a team-wise effort. And that's something we also want to build into the lab so that you get a feel for that. It also leads to issues of how do you communicate with each other when you come from different disciplines. But the goal here is to mold, meld, integrate the talents, and that's part of your job too. Finally, of course, the idea is you come up with a solution as a team. And so that's really the goal. We'll see how it unfolds. So back to Tamara or whoever will oversee the questions, and we're happy to answer them.
Yeah.
I can get us started with one. So can you talk a little bit about how you might approach mapping something like a physical community or location versus something less straightforward like an issue or an idea? How does that process look different?
With a physical map, you generally, unless it's in a place that you can't access, But if it is a place that you can access, you can walk around, right, in a neighborhood. You still have to make a lot of similar choices. You have to decide what goes in the map and what gets left out, right? You can't include everything. So are you just going to name, right, street addresses? Are you going to name, if you pass by an office building, are you going to name every single occupant of that? Was it an apartment building? Are you going to do the same thing? Stores? What level of granularity are you going to be mapping, right? But at least even though you have a lot of those decisions to make, you can walk around and physically see what is there. With stakeholder or ecological maps or issue mapping, you have to approach things from a slightly different angle, right? You have to often start with I guess you might call them metaphorically the tall buildings, right? Who obviously comes to mind in this particular issue? What are some agencies or some organizations or some individuals who are well known that might be in that space that you're already aware of? You can look at news coverage, you can look at government websites and that sort of thing and get that top level. But then you've got to go even deeper and figure out, like I said, that what are the relationships between them? How are they coming at this? If you have 4 different organizations that are all involved in something to do with poverty, what differentiates them, and how can I represent those differences and the connections between them in a way that will help me understand what might be left out, as I mentioned before. So that means, going through documents, means talking to people and really drilling down and letting that unfold. You can't just walk around the neighborhood and just tell immediately who is involved in the issue. What did I leave out, Felipe?
Well, no, this is pretty comprehensive. And of course, the devil's in the detail. Every one of these will be different depending on where you're starting, whether you're approaching it by the people involved or the issues involved. But that's where the teamwork comes in. And so you're going to be solving some problems that are really not easy to define initially. So there is some fact finding that's needed, defining the problem, and understanding what are the questions, the further data you need to capture in order to come up with a game plan that you can begin to implement. And the last point I would make, that is iterative. That is a living document, so to speak.
Yes.
You put something together, but as you get more information, you adjust it and you adjust again. But it's a dynamic process. And that's really what's behind real world problem solving. It's not just one thing or a quick thing. It's a process. And we want you to experiment and understand how that unfolds.
That's actually one of the issues that some people have with this term of map. If you take it as a noun, it seems like a static thing, right? If I look at a map,
yeah,
that is what things are. But how things look, that's it. We've drawn it, we've mapped it, we can move on. But we see all the time that maps change, that new buildings go up, countries shift borders, all kinds of things change. So even physical maps are really evolving, but and dynamic, as Felipe said. But also these are even more so because they are maps of people and organizations who change, are much more fluid in their evolution and dynamics, and that makes it slippery, but also really exciting. And as Felipe said, that's part of doing anything, any kind of social impact work.
So I'm going to intervene here since we have some questions coming up in the chat and we're running short of time, and I want to make sure that these interested people get some address of their questions. To your last point, if you have one handy that you can show us that you've developed, that would be great if you could bring it up. And then I'm going to, while you're looking for that, the first question comes up about what kinds of resources you might have for identifying and mapping stakeholders, especially the most vulnerable ones in a community, because that doesn't necessarily show up on a website or even on a sign in a building. and then Dawn, that I don't know if you can see the questions, but I know you have a particular interest in gun violence prevention in your own research. So that might be something that you may take up that particular question about recommending whether to take it at the local level or the federal level when you're looking at stakeholder mapping.
Oh, those are some big questions. I was looking and because I know that our students did their stakeholder maps last year, but I don't have them in file. So I need to find them on campus. So I don't have a stakeholder map ready. And also, Felipe mentioned the concentric rings earlier. That is one approach. Another is a more network approach. So there are a lot of different ones. And what we will do in the class is present a few different ways that you can tackle it. Not that there's only one way to do it. So
I've seen them where they look like mind maps.
Yes, exactly. Some of them are more, yes, like mind maps, like conceptual, just diagrams, or some of them are very dense, like networks, and show those kinds of aggregations. There are a lot of ways to go about it. So you can find a lot of examples out there, but this would be an opportunity to make one. I think I missed. I was listening, but I know there was a whole
sorry.
bunch of
The second
questions.
question is resources for identifying and mapping stakeholders that they're especially among the most vulnerable ones in a community. So it's easy to get the big CEOs of nonprofits, but what about actual clients, if you will? And then the other one has to do with if you're tackling a social issue like gun violence prevention, how would you recommend the scale of it? Do you start at the federal level or the local level?
Why don't you take the first one, Felipe, and I'll take the second one.
The first, well, I guess I wanted to make a comment too, because it came from the students themselves last time. And that is, this is a very different class, and many of them were really delighted because it gave them a chance to put to work things that in other classes they couldn't. So from that perspective, we hope that you'll take a risk, so to speak, and come and join us. But it is a different experience. On the other hand, without doubt, all of them really found it very valuable for them. So we invite you to join us. Remind me of now the first part.
Resources.
How do you
identifying vulnerable stakeholders?
Yeah.
Well, there again, what we can do, for example, you can start with whatever the problem is from the literature itself. It's not proximal to the current environment, but you can find out what are the conditions that lead to vulnerability. But then the issue is to look for those in the local setting so that you can identify what kinds of people, like homeless, that was one of our projects. That is a vulnerability. What is the profile in the local community? And then how do you address it at the local level? So that's one approach, at least from my end. Dr. Gilpin, other comments?
Yeah, I'll just build on that because it also kind of offers a nice segue. So in the project that the students did last year, they wanted to look at the problem of homelessness. And so they started digging into what do we know about homelessness in the Phoenix metro area? And that also, because homelessness on a national level, it's too big and there are too many different dynamics. There are so many different variables. So looking at it in Phoenix, they found that trying to identify the most vulnerable. Well, there are a lot of programs for youth who are in schools. But after the age of 18 or after school age, then there was kind of a void. So they identified among the most vulnerable as young adults. So they focused their attention on young adults who were outside of school age. And so there were very few programs available to help them. And that's a good segue into when you're tackling a big issue. If you want to make meaningful change, I think you might want to look into larger, like what do we know about the dynamics, what causes, for example, homelessness or gun violence or domestic or intimate partner or sexual violence. What do we know about how these things play out and who is harmed and who are most vulnerable? But in order to actually tackle a problem, you really need to focus, not even just, in Phoenix. We can't say we're going to tackle sexual violence in Phoenix. That's still too big, unfortunately. So we would have to, narrow that down even more. What particular population are we talking about? What particular part of town are we talking about? What are some more specifics? How can we identify that? And that often, again, is an iterative process that you use a combination of, you can look at media coverage, you can look at literature, but then also talking to people who work in these sectors, people who work in domestic violence shelters or women's shelters, or who are in advocates for gun control. Those kinds of people can give you information. They can tell you who they work with, who they don't work with, and why, and that can guide you in identifying where those gaps are that you can make a difference.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, if you just look around, even here within the Maricopa County, various communities differ a lot from each other, and who lives in it, and the ecology, et cetera. So it really does require, as Dr. Gilpin said, for a realistic intervention, at least at the initial level, it's important to drill down and get more granularity to think about neighborhoods. Even a change that's socially important in a neighborhood is a major accomplishment. So think in those terms, not because we don't want you to think of the bigger picture, but the bigger picture needs to be incorporated into a solution which can be implemented, at least initially, at the local level, and then it could be built into something for future that has other communities involved. So you can build upward from the first approach.
Yeah, and I caught in the Q&A, I was just looking, in terms of integrating issues, there are a lot of ways to do that conceptually. You can have bubbles. Sometimes people, if they use the concentric ring model, they divide the circle into quadrants or segments. And so they group stakeholders within, sub issues within the larger thing. So these people, if you're looking at homelessness is your core issue, one segment, people who deal with young people or children, or people with disabilities and homelessness, or those who have, recent job loss, that are just struggling to kind of make it cover a gap period. So there are a lot of different, you can break it up that way, or you can have, you can have the issues as nodes in your network. Again, lots of different ways to come at it. And those are some of the tools that we'll be playing with in the course as well.
So please do consider enrolling in the class. The information is in the chat, and the registration is open. We also ask that you can fill out the survey, that the information link is also in the chat, so that you can give us feedback on this series and what you'd like to see in it going forward. Very few graduate colleges across the country offer programming like this. So this will be something that will give you a little bit of a unique je ne sais quoi going forward in your own.
Oh, definitely. It's an amazing opportunity that is valued, as we said, by employers in just about any field, and will give you some skills that most graduate students don't get the opportunity to hone, because graduate education tends to be focused more on narrowing your area of specialization, and this is about deliberately broadening it in exciting ways. And we know from research that transdisciplinary work is really vital for creativity and innovation. So
Exactly.
Absolutely. And I'd like to mention one more thing. There's so much to say. One of the key elements in all this is leadership, the capacity to be a leader, but also a leader that brings people together and that can bring the best out of the team. So besides transdisciplinary, there's got to be a way to make the conditions there, to put the conditions there for all to work as a team and come up with a great solution that can also be implemented in local settings.
Thank you very much for those comments. I want to also thank my colleagues from the Graduate College who've been working behind the scenes to make sure that this has kept us running, even though we had a little bit of a bumpy start. Heather Fowland, who is the program manager for this initiative, and Amanda Apey, the director of our student support resources. And we have a question here about online students. Could I ask you to send us an email with that question, and we'll follow up on that. And because there's kind of a complicated answer to it. All right, thank you so much to our speakers. Yay. And
Thank you for having us. And thanks to everybody who came today.
And we look forward to seeing you by whatever means you connect with us. We're happy to respond. Thank
And
you.
yes, feel free to reach out also if you have more questions.
yes. Our next such talk is scheduled for April 15th, Tax Day. We are going to make the topic responsive to you. So that's another reason why it's important to fill out the survey and tell us what you want to hear. So thanks, and I'm going to release you to the rest of your day and week. And again, great big thanks for our speakers and our colleagues. Take care. Have a great day.
Bye. Thank you.